Oh, good evening. Be opening your Bibles to 1 Kings 19. 1 Kings 19, and tonight's lesson is somewhat going to fall in line with our Sunday morning Bible study. We're going to notice some things about Elijah this evening. It's good to see you back with us for worship tonight. I hope you had a good day. I'm noticing that the clock says it's 5:23. And so if my math is correct, that means I've got about an hour and 37 minutes to preach. And so it's going to be a good one tonight. I'm telling you what. I feel it. It's going to be good. No, I'm only kidding. Gary said that that meant that he could sing until 6, and then I got my turn. So he didn't do that, so I won't preach that long. I want you to think about how challenging it is sometimes to see God. I'm not talking about seeing His face with your eyes. I'm talking about understanding and knowing that He is there and that He cares. Sometimes it is indeed a challenge to see God. Generally speaking, when things are going well in life and when we have relatively no problems in life, usually it's fairly easy to see God, and it's easy to keep focused on Him. But oftentimes when things take a turn for the worse in our lives, we have problems seeing God. It can become challenging to see Him and to stay focused on Him. And I think that happened to some degree in the life of Elijah. And yet God continued to work with him and through him in order to help him see himself better. That's what I want to talk about tonight, the challenge to see God. Why do we sometimes have a challenge, and how can we overcome or defeat that challenge in order that we might be able to constantly and continually stay focused on God? In Romans chapter 1 and verse 20, the Apostle Paul said, "For the invisible attributes of God are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even His eternal power and Godhead." In other words, Paul is telling the Roman brethren that when you look out into the creation that we live in called earth, it's very easy to see that there is a Creator. It's very easy to see even the attributes, the characteristics of God just by looking out into His creation, the physical things that we see, things like His Godhead, things like His power. It's easy to see those things. And yet sometimes, even though we have that evidence of God on the earth, it's still sometimes challenging to see Him. Heard tell of a story of a preacher and his brother who were from Ohio. And the preacher's brother, the preacher ended up moving to Tennessee here and stayed for some time. Well, his brother comes to visit with him, and the preacher decides he's going to take his brother up into the mountains of East Tennessee. And on the way up the mountain, the brother was clinging to the trees, like he was pretty terrified that something might happen. But you see, once they got to the top of that mountain, they both were relieved, and they enjoyed the remarkable views that they saw from there. As they began descending down the mountain, they decided to focus on the beauty of the scenery instead of maybe the danger that lay around them. And they discovered something on the way down that mountain and actually on the way home. They discovered that there was as much beauty to be found along the drive that they took to get there as there was in the destination. There was beauty there all along, even before they went up the mountain. They just couldn't stop and see it for some reason. It's been said before that seeing is believing. That statement is true in many, many instances in life. It's certainly easier to place confidence in something that you can see, something maybe that you can hold with your hands or examine with your eyes. And Thomas certainly was one who thought that was true. Now, I don't want you to think I'm railing on Thomas, because I think what Thomas did is acceptable. But you think about the attitude of Thomas. 3 days after Jesus was crucified, Thomas stood among the other disciples who were trying to convince him that Jesus was alive. And in John chapter 20 and verse 25, you might remember Thomas saying something like this, "Unless I see it with my own eyes, I will not believe it." And Thomas has gotten a bad rap over the years for that statement that he made, and even the other statement that he made, that he wanted to see the prints of the nails in his hand and the hole in his side in order that he would believe. And yet all Thomas was doing was asking for some evidence. But nonetheless, the principle remains true. It's much easier, it was going to be easier for Thomas to believe that Jesus was still alive if he could touch him with his hands, if he could see him with his eyes. He wasn't satisfied until that happened. You know, one of the many great challenges in building our faith is learning to see God and being willing to recognize that He is with us in the good times and the bad. One of the last things Jesus uttered, not the last, but one of the last things Jesus uttered before He ascended back into heaven is found in Matthew 28 and verse 20. "Lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age." And again, yet sometimes it's still hard for us to see that. Most of us Christians have witnessed the power of God working in our life. But, like Thomas, sometimes we go through stages when our attitude toward God is, "What have you shown me lately?" That's our attitude sometimes. You know, when times get tough, when things don't go as we plan in life, we begin doubting, questioning whether God is present, whether He is near us. But you see, if we just stop and pause for a moment, we might just see the beauty of God working in our life. And so, again, this was the case in the life of Elijah. He begins to question God's presence. Now, in our Bible study this morning, we looked at how he goes and prophesies something to King Ahab, and from there, the prophecy comes true, and he goes to a widow's house in the city of Zarephath, and he's cared for there, and he helps the widow in return. And we also saw that after that he goes to Mount Carmel and battles with the prophets of Baal. But you know, I'm interested tonight particularly in what happens after that. God begins to show him, if you will, now don't take this statement too literally, especially in our life today, but God shows Elijah through a still small voice, if you will, that He was still working, that He was still there on behalf of His people. Let's look at 1 Kings 19 this evening. Beginning in verse 1, we read, "And Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, also how he had executed all the prophets with the sword." Of course, he's talking about what I just described, how he had prophesied the drought and it came to pass, and how he had been to the widow's house in Zarephath, and how he had battled with the prophets of Baal. And so Ahab comes and tells his wife Jezebel about these things. Then Jezebel, verse 2, sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, "So let the gods do to me and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of one of them by tomorrow about this time." And so she's going to go after Elijah, and she's going to try to kill him with everything that she has. Verse 3, when he saw that, he arose and ran for his life, and he went to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and left his servant there. But he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree. And he prayed that he might die and said, "It is enough. Now, Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my fathers." Then as he lay and slept under a broom tree, suddenly an angel touched him and said to him, "Arise and eat." Then he looked, and there by his head was a cake baked on coals and a jar of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. And an angel of the Lord came back a second time, and he touched him and said, "Arise and eat, because the journey is too great for you." So he arose and ate and drank, and he went in the strength of that food 40 days and 40 nights as far as Horeb, the mountain of God. Now the story doesn't stop there, but we're going to focus on those 8 verses and learn some things from them tonight. Number one, let's consider the fact that it is indeed easy to see God working in our lives when things are going well. Now, Elijah's life was very full of positive things, and during those times it was easy for him to see God doing great things. The events that I just described, how in chapter 17 he stands before Ahab and prophesies to him about the drought. Moving on, he was fed by ravens and he drank from the brook Kerith. He cared for the widow of Zarephath. He raised her son from the dead. He defeats 450 prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. And then he prophesies again and the rain comes back. And so his life was very full of positive things and things where it was easy for him to see God working in his life. You know, there are numerous examples of people who, when things were going good, saw God's power and His presence, and thus it ignited faith in Him for those people. For instance, think about the Israelites as they leave Egyptian bondage and they begin their journey toward that promised land. Do you think it was easy for them to see God working in their life? Certainly it was. And as they go further on that journey and God promises to guide them with a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, it's easy for them to see God. In Exodus 12, verses 50 and 51, we read, "Then all the children of Israel did as the Lord commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. It came to pass on the same day that the Lord brought the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt according to their armies." And if you keep reading, you see how happy they were about that and how it ignited faith in these people for God. You know, the disciples are another good example of this. For the 3 years that they were with Jesus, in particular, think about Peter. And it was easy often for the disciples, the apostles, to see Jesus and to see God working in their life. So much so that when we come to the Garden of Gethsemane and the soldiers come to arrest Jesus, you remember Peter's reaction. You know, he draws his sword out and he cuts off one of the ears of the high priest's servant. And so the ability that he had to see God and to see Jesus working in his life ignited him to greater faith in Christ. Now, what he did wasn't necessarily the right thing to do. And Jesus, you might remember, tells him to put away his sword. But he was able to see God. The early church is another great example of this. You know, in Acts chapter 2, just beginning there in Acts chapter 2, as the church is established and Peter preaches to them on that day, they could see God working in their life. Especially toward the end of Acts chapter 2, as you see the church gathering themselves together and having so much in common and sharing everything that they had, they could see God working in their lives through other people. And it was easy for them to see that. It's easy for us to see the presence and the power of God when things are going well. And in such times, our faith and our courage is strong, and that is great and wonderful. There's seemingly nothing that we wouldn't do for the Lord. But you see, what happens when times get tough? What happens when things don't go quite like we plan in life? Number 2, consider with me that when times do get tough, many lose sight of God. Many lose their sense of purpose in God. That was the case with Elijah. I want you to imagine such a man who had so many great things happen in his lifetime. Imagine God working these miracles through you and seeing firsthand evidence of what God can do. And yet when he finds out that Jezebel is trying to kill him, well, he runs away from it and hides. You know, it was nothing for God to help Elijah raise that widow's son from the dead. It was nothing for God to cause that little bit of flour and that little bit of oil that she had to last until the drought was over. And yet Elijah seemingly must have thought to himself that it was too much for God to help him and to keep him alive. So he runs away and he hides in the wilderness. I believe this was a weak moment in the life of Elijah. He loses sight of God because he had done extraordinary things, but now he's terrified. You see, what really happened was this. His triumph turned to trial. His faith had been replaced by fear. His courage had been overpowered and overshadowed by cowardliness. And his depression has overshadowed his duty. That's what happened in the life of Elijah. And in his dejection, Elijah thus viewed himself as a miserable failure. And he begins to wallow in self-pity. 2 times the Lord asks him, Elijah, what are you doing here? That's in the following verses, in verse 9 and in verse 13. He went up into a cave and spent the night in that place, and behold, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said to him, what are you doing here, Elijah? You drop down to verse 13, and he says it again. It happened when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in a mantle and went out and stood in the entrance of the cave, and suddenly a voice came to him and said, what are you doing here, Elijah? What are you doing here? See, that's the voice that Elijah heard when he was having a hard time seeing God and remembering his purpose in God. God comes to him and asks him, what are you doing here? Because he had lost focus, God comes to him and reminds him of his focus. Now, we also have this part or this phase of life pictured throughout the Scriptures. And we can go back and use the same examples that we used earlier about people who, when things were good, they could see God. Well, later on, as things begin to get bad, when things don't go as they plan, then they lose focus of God. Let's begin again with the Israelites. When the Egyptians begin to pursue them and they're heading toward the Red Sea, the Israelites lose sight of God momentarily, and they're terrified. And you remember the Israelites, they want to turn back and go to Egypt because certainly they don't want to die. And so, as great and wonderful as it was for them to be focused on God, when leaving Egypt, they lose sight of Him when things get bad. The disciples, immediately following the Lord's arrest, flee because they were afraid. And can you imagine the people who had been with Jesus for 3 years? Can you just picture the scene here? They'd seen what Jesus could do. Raising people from the dead, curing all kinds of sickness and illness. And yet when He's arrested, they begin to be afraid. They flee out of fear. I don't understand it. But sometimes that's what happens in our life too. And yes, the very same Peter who stood so boldly and courageously and faithfully beside the Lord in the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus is on trial, denies Him 3 times. You remember the people come to him and said, aren't you one of His disciples? Peter says, no, I don't know what you're talking about. And a little bit later on, they find Him warming himself at a fire. And they say, you're one of His disciples. You're a Galilean. They said, no, you're crazy. I don't know what you're talking about. And the 3rd time they come to him and they say, I saw you with Him. You are one of His followers. He's cursing and swearing. I don't know the man. And so when things got tough, Peter, as great as he was, lost sight of God. Many of the first century congregations who experienced much success early on struggled mightily when persecution came. You read about the strong congregations in the book of Acts, and yet when you come to the book of Revelation and you see especially those 7 churches of Asia, you see their weaknesses and you see how they lost focus of God because things had gotten tough. Now the question is, have you ever felt like Elijah? Have you ever lost sight of God? Have you ever cowered down in your life as a Christian, losing focus of God? Well, maybe not. I hope you haven't, but chances are we probably have all felt like Elijah at some point in our life. And it's at those low points in life that we begin to doubt God's presence. It's not that God loses sight of us, but that we lose sight of God. We begin to take our eyes off of Him when difficulties arise. You remember the great chapter in Hebrews about faith, Hebrews 11? And you have listed all of these faithful men and what they did and what they accomplished with the Lord working with them and through them. And then you come to chapter 12 and you read, therefore, since we are compassed about with such a great cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin that so easily besets us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Verse 2 says, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set down before Him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is now sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. The point is this: when things get tough in your life, don't lose sight of God. If Jesus could go through what He did and never lose sight of God, surely we could do that. I mean, I know we're going to have times when we falter and fail and struggle in life and we have weaknesses, but don't lose sight of God. It's much easier to do that, friends, if you keep studying the Word of God. Read it and apply it to your life. Colossians 3 and verse 2, Paul encouraged those brethren to set their minds on things above, not on things on the earth. And if we do that, we'll not lose sight of God. Now, I want to conclude by thinking about how we can improve the concept we're talking about. How can we be sure that we don't lose focus on God? Our vision of God, this is point number 3, our vision of God will be clearer if we learn to walk by faith and not by sight. Our vision of God will be much clearer if we learn to walk by faith and not by sight. One of Elijah's problems was that he was looking for God instead of listening to God. Now you think about that. He was looking for God instead of listening to Him. His faith was based solely on what he could see. And because he couldn't see God and see God working in his life, he lost his sight in God. Surely God could have swept out the wicked house of Ahab to oblivion with a mighty wind. I mean, you think that these are things that Elijah would have thought about. If God could do what He had done in the life of Elijah, surely He could have wiped out Ahab and Jezebel. He could have opened the gates of hell with a single earthquake. He could have scorched Ahab's throne with a terrible inferno. However, God didn't do that. But did that mean Elijah had failed? No. Did it mean God had left Elijah? No. Had God's word returned void? No. You see, the still small voice that God sends to Ahab, what are you doing here? That little voice that God sends to him through an angel is what prompted Jezebel. It was prompted Elijah, It was at work, just like a little leaven in a batch of dough works to leaven the whole batch of dough. See, it's easy for us to maintain our faith in God when we see Him working. However, true faith is not merely believing and trusting in the things that can be seen. True faith is trusting and believing in that we cannot see. Hebrews 11 and verse 1, you may remember, says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen. And Bible faith is something that is based on evidence. We can't see God, but we have evidence of Him working in our life all around us. And that's what our faith should stand on. Romans 8, 24 and 25 says, for we are saved by hope. But hope that is seen is not hope. For what a man sees, why does he still hope for it? If we hope for that we see, then we with patience wait for it. And so, hope will one day disappear. But if you see it, you can't hope for it. We don't always see God working in our life. But if we take time and we slow down and we listen for God's voice, primarily through His Word, we'll understand that He hasn't left us. Of course, Paul told the Corinthian brethren in 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 7, we walk by faith and not by sight. And again, you would think that Elijah would have understood this, but this was his problem, and it's our problem sometimes too. Sometimes we're not walking by faith. Walking by faith begins by hearing His voice, Romans 10:17. Walking by faith then transmits what He says into action, into doing His will. Matthew 7 and verse 21, James 1, 21 to 25 talk about doing the will of God. And Elijah's faith was tested when God asked him to go. And he goes and he walks out of that cave on that occasion by faith. Now we didn't read that part, but if you read the rest of chapter 19, you see that. After that voice comes to him and then God ultimately says, go, he goes. by faith. And it's only when we walk by faith, when we learn to walk by faith and not by sight, that we'll truly see and know God. Friends, I assure you that your faith, like Elijah's, will be tested. And I pray that we'll never forget that despite whatever difficulties we might face, God is always there. Hebrews 13, verses 5 and 6 talks about God never leaving us nor forsaking us, so that we can boldly say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear what man can do to me. That's something Elijah needed to hear, wasn't it? I'll never leave you nor forsake you, so you can boldly say, the Lord is my helper. I'll not fear what man can do to me. The final question tonight is this: do you have the kind of faith that both sees and hears God? Of course, 1 John 4, verses 12 and 13 says, no one has seen God. If we love one another, God abides in us, and His love is perfected in this. By this we know that we abide in Him and He in us, because He has given us His Spirit. And so, friends, do you see God tonight? Are you focused on Him? Are you focused on His Word? Are you walking by faith? If you're having a challenge tonight seeing God, why don't you let us help you? We'll help you in any way that we can to have a stronger faith in God, to walk by faith and not by sight. If you need assistance tonight in any way, you're subject to the invitation, come and let us know as we stand and sing.
On behalf of the Lawnville Road Church of Christ, I want to thank you for joining us today for our worship. If you ever have an opportunity, we invite you to join us at our physical location at 1301 Lawnville Road in Kingston, Tennessee. We hope you will come and experience the simplicity of New Testament Christianity, to learn about God and to become a part of His family. If you have questions, if you would like to know more about the Bible, or if you would like a home Bible study, feel free to contact us by calling 865-717-0444. Or for more information, please visit our website at www.lawnvilleroadcoc.org. Again, we thank you, and we hope you have a blessed day.